I'm back. Yes. The microphone finally came in after 2 weeks. So I'm sure many of you were wondering what happened. So basically what happened was I got the new microphone, and obviously it took a little bit. It wasn't like an overnight delivery. So I had to wait I don't know, I think it was like 7 days altogether, right? And so I wait my 7 days patiently and get the microphone. Well, lo and behold, I never took into consideration that the audio interface that I had would not be compatible with the new microphone that I got. So I had to get a new audio interface, and that obviously extended the amount of time that I wasn't able to record some videos. But I am back now, and basically what we are going to do is pick up where we left off, which was we were starting to cover the TD Ameritrade API client library. Now, for those of you who kind of follow my community channel on my Facebook, you already know that this library is actually right now on GitHub. So you can go on GitHub right now and you will find this library. It's not 100% complete, but most of the endpoints that all of you will be using are good to go. The option chain one is good. The watch list item still needs a thing or two, but for the most part, it's pretty good. And then the orders one has to be finished as well. So if you want to know where that is, well, let me help. Oh, that was my last page. Okay, so, this is my normal one. Also, FYI, I did update a lot here. I kind of reorganized it and then just kind of changed the layout of this kind of stuff just to kind of get everything up to date and things like that. But that's again for another time. Funny thing is I do like how this microphone decided to die literally, I think it was like a day after my 1-year anniversary of starting to record videos. So I don't know if that was a sign or not, but it is what it is, right? So right now, if you go under my username, so aread1192, you will see a repository called TD Ameritrade Python API. And so this is basically everything that I have currently up with the library. Again, there are some things that have to be finished, but once it is finished, the goal is to make this a package that you can install using pip. So you would be able to just do pip install Python API, whatever you want to call it, and it would be able to install. I do try to put some information down here as to what the features are and things like that. But more than likely, what you are concerned with is the actual library. So if you go into the TD folder, you will see my different Python files. And the one that you're mostly going to be concerned with is the client Py file. And so this is everything you need to authenticate yourself with the API and start making requests. So that is good to go. I've changed some things since the last video just because things like the refresh token I realized was not being stored correctly, or if it was, then it was getting overridden at a certain different point. So I wanted to fix that so that way, again, the authentication was working as expected. So from our previous video, it might look a little bit different, but generally it's the same exact output. And then again, it has all the endpoints as well. So I will be probably adding to this a little bit more, but generally for the most part, it's good to go. The orders one is where a lot of the work still needs to kind of to be done. There is just such complexity here that I have to really think through how I want to approach certain things. And it's not necessarily clear sometimes as to what is the best approach or which type of arguments have to be used together. So orders is definitely more complicated, but it is being worked on as we speak. So really cool stuff there. And people have already been sending me code and modifications. By all means, if you think there is an easier way to do this, or if you think there is a better way to do this, by all means, share. I'm happy to add it to the library if you think it can be useful to other people, because I am just looking at it from my perspective and there might be another way to look at it. So definitely some cool stuff. All right. So with that being said, let's jump back into it. All right. Let's go back to our API file. I changed a lot, unfortunately, but again, for the most part, I would say it's pretty similar to what you saw in the previous videos, and I really debated if I just should start the series all over again. But I think if you've seen the other videos and then you see the changes that I made, you're probably gonna go like, oh, okay, I see what you're doing here. Like nothing super complicated, nothing super crazy. It's really just kind of changing what needed to be changed and kind of simplifying or expanding what needed to be simplified or expand. So again, nothing super crazy changed. It would be something like, oh, okay, so now when I'm making a request, I add this to my client ID, just really basic stuff like that. So pretty cool. And then in our last video, we did talk about one of the validation functions that I created for this library. This would make interacting with the library a little bit more, I would say it naturally. So things like, oh, I can pass through a list of arguments and it knows how to handle that list of arguments. And we demonstrated leveraging this function inside our get quotes endpoint. And so the get quotes endpoint is just making a simple request to the get quotes endpoint, which returns things like real-time quotes, things along that nature. So good information. Unfortunately, it's Saturday, so it's not going to be super useful right now because the quotes really aren't changing for the most part. But during the weekdays, I've seen people use it. I've built trading robots that have literally been leveraging this API, and it's working just like I was expecting, which I was kind of shocked, to be honest. I thought there would be more headaches. And I mean, some are a little bit, but I mean, it's more related to, well, how do I make sure this is running during the market hours? But as for making the request, really haven't run into any issues with that. So what we're going to do first is we are going to get a new function that will help us validate the next endpoint that we're going to build. I just have to make sure that I have a copy of it, and I think it's on the next one. Oh, you know what? I think this was the one where I was going to copy it because I was afraid I was not going to be able to remember it at first. Yeah, this is the one I'm going to copy. This, I don't know what it is about this function, but I can never seem to like look at my notes and understand exactly what's going on. And I don't think that's a good thing, but it works. All right, let me grab it. So this is the one that's currently on, what is it, GitHub. So this is what you would see there. Okay. And this one I have to kind of sometimes just sit back and like, okay, what am I saying when I'm writing this? All right. So instead of writing it, I'm just going to kind of explain what it is. So this method is called the validate arguments method. And what it's designed to do is for certain endpoints where you can have multiple parameters, it's going to validate the arguments of those parameters. So certain parameters, so for example, I have one right here, the search instruments endpoint. It has a parameter called projection, and that parameter projection can have multiple different types of arguments. It can have fundamental, it can have search regex, it can have symbol regex, just different types of possible values. What this method is intended to do is, if possible, it's going to validate your particular argument. So it's going to say, hey, Alex, you passed through Bob. Bob is not a valid argument for this particular parameter name that belongs to this particular endpoint. Here's your list of options. So that's what the design is. It's designed to help make building the request more straightforward. And if you make an error, it's going to try to help point you in the right direction as to how to fix it. So how do we build it? Well, right now what we're doing is we take three different arguments. One is the endpoint, so the name of the endpoint. One is the parameter name that we want to validate. So again, we could have multiple parameters for a particular endpoint. This one just takes one. And from there, well, technically it can take multiple, but I'll get to that later. It's going to take those parameter names, and then it's going to validate the argument that you pass through for that particular parameter. So again, if I want to check your projection parameter and I noticed you pass through fundamental, you'll be good to go. There'll be no issues. So that's what this is designed to do. Now, how do we do this? Well, if you go right up here to the top, you'll see that the first thing I do is I grab this thing called parameters dictionary. Oh, and it comes from the class object, and it has this property. It looks like endpoint arguments. Well, that kind of sounds familiar. I thought we covered this. Ah, we did. Look at that. So the self.endpoint arguments is basically a dictionary that contains all the endpoints, all the possible parameters for those endpoints, and then all the possible values for that particular parameter. So if you wanted to read this, you would say, hey, there is an endpoint called search instruments. That particular endpoint does have a parameter called projection, and it can be one of these possible 5 values. If it's not one of these possible 5 values, I will be raising an error to let you know. For a little bit more of a complicated one, we have the get movers endpoint. This has 3 different parameters. One is called market, one is called direction, and one is called change. Each one of these parameters has these possible values. If it's not one of those values, I will be raising an error. So that's how you need to think about that little dictionary. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to go back down here. Okay, so we grab that dictionary. More specifically, we grab the dictionary that contains all the parameters for our particular endpoint. And then from there, we grab all the possible values for that parameter. So I take that endpoint that I passed through to grab the dictionary, and then I grab the parameter list that I want to validate. So I grab all the values that belong to that parameter. And then what I do is I say, okay, well, the first thing I need to check is what was passed through. If what was passed through is a list, that means we're going to have to validate multiple parameter names. That's kind of how you would think about this first section. If it's a list, that means there's multiple parameter names that we have to validate. So what we're going to do is, using list comprehension, we're going to say for each argument in our parameter arguments list, we're going to see if that argument is not in the parameter, basically the list of possible parameter arguments. Now, what does this mean? It means all of these should return false. If any of them return true, then we have an error, potentially. And so that's what this section is going to be doing. It's going to be validating to make sure that, hey, everything that we checked for does exist in the possible arguments list. That's the important part. So we want to make sure that they exist. If they're not, then we're going to raise a value error. And then if they are, if any of them are, so in other words, if any of them don't exist in the list, then we're going to raise an error. Otherwise, we're just going to go and move on to the next step. We're basically going to return true. Now, that's if it's a list. So that's if you do something like this to me and say, hey, Alex, there's multiple potential, values that this could take on. I need you to check each one. That's what it's doing. And then the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to say, okay, well, if the parameter argument is not in the possible list of arguments, again, raise an error. So this is assuming that you only gave me one value. So this assumes you gave me one value. This assumes you gave me a list of values that I need to validate. So if you gave me one value and I don't see it in that list, I'm going to raise an error. If it is in that list, okay, we're good to go. That means you're fine and we can move on to the next step. So that's really what this method is doing. It's just validating the parameters that you're passing through when you're making a request to a particular endpoint, because I'm going to try to do my best to validate it if I can. Okay, so now that we've shown what that method does, let's see it in action. So we're now going to define a new method, and it will do something called search instruments. So this will reference the search instruments endpoint. And what it will do is it allows you to search for different instruments doing different search methods. So it does take an argument. It's called symbol. I don't even know how to pronounce that. We'll set that equal to none to begin with. And then there's projection. Projection is basically specifying the type of search that we want to do. Now, in the library, I have it defaulted to symbol search. I might change that. I might do something in the future where I just have it set to none. But for right now, I think it's fine just keeping it as is. So once we've done that, we can kind of leverage what we were doing up here, but the first thing that we can do is we can take these two guys, because really that's just, we do that with every request. First thing we're going to do is validate the token. We want to make sure it's not expired. And then if that's okay, we do also want to make sure that we have our headers. And so the headers is what we send along with our request. Very important, we send along headers with our request. All right, and then from here, we can now validate the arguments. So we're going to say self validate arguments, and then we need to specify the endpoint. And so with this one, the endpoint is called search instruments. I hope I spelled that right. And then we're going to have a parameter. Where is it? Parameter name. And this one is called projection. So that means for the search instruments endpoint, there is a parameter called projection. Hey, that's what this is. So that looks pretty good so far, right? So once we've done that, there's still one more argument that we have to pass through, and that is the parameter argument itself. I'm probably going to change the name of that just because personally I think it's a little bit confusing, but when I wrote it, it didn't seem confusing at the time. So what it's going to do is it's going to take whatever was passed through here. So basically, if you pass through something, that's going to override the default value, unless it's symbol search to begin with. And it's going to validate that for us. Okay, and now that we've done that, we can build our parameters list, basically. So we can define our parameters, because at this point, if there was an error, it should be raising it. And we'll create a new dictionary. And the first one is going to be called API key. And that's going to say self.config. And then we want the consumer ID. Okay, so now that we've done that, we want the next one to be the symbol parameter, and that will just take through the symbol that we passed through. Okay, and then the final one is projection. And so this is the type of search that we are doing. And with this one, again, it's just whatever we pass through. Okay, so now that we've done that, we can define our endpoints. So define our endpoints. And so what we can do is we can call a new variable called endpoint, and this will be / instruments. Yes, instruments. Okay, and then what we're going to do is make the request. And so we'll say return, because this is a function and we want to return the response. And so we're going to say request.get. We're going to set that URL parameter. Oh, forgot the most important part. We need the URL. So we're just going to build that URL. And really all we're doing is we're just taking this little endpoint that we defined up above and just passing it through. So this is just going to build that URL for us, again, from the previous videos. Hopefully that serves as a reminder. Okay, so we're going to define our URL. We're going to define our headers, and that will be our merged headers. And then, you know what I just realized? I'm going to make this a little bit larger. Well, maybe not that large. Okay, so we're going to take our merged headers, and then from here, we're going to define our parameters, params, and then that one will equal our data. And then we want to make sure we send a verified request. And so we'll just set that equal to true. And then from there, we're going to do .json to parse that response. So hopefully at this point, this should all look relatively familiar. It's pretty similar to what we did before. Okay, so now that we've done that, I'm going to save my file and we can test it out once I figure out what my error is. Indent does not match. Dun-dun-dun. Oh yeah, that wouldn't look like it matches. Hopefully that works. Oh, God. I indented that one too much. I copied over some of that code before, so naturally. Okay, I think it's good now. Perfect. All right, so I'm going to put this down a little bit so you can see it. Again, if you don't remember, all we do is we create a new session. So we initialize a new session. We pass through the arguments that we need. So things like our account number, account password, redirect URI, consumer ID. And then there's this kind of optional one that if you don't set, it's going to automatically be set for you, which is cache state. So we initialize a new session. We log into that new session. And here, basically what we were doing was making a request to the get quotes endpoint. So hopefully that one sounds familiar. All right, so now what we're gonna do is we're gonna test out this search instruments endpoint. Okay, perfect. All right, I'm gonna save it, make sure there's no errors. Oh, no. This one's obviously because I haven't defined it, but that's fine. Okay. And so again, if this is the first time you've seen this library, this is kind of the neat thing about this particular library. So in previous videos, I have authenticated myself. So if you had seen my previous ones, we had this huge complicated mess when it came to getting the refresh token and then making sure that when it was expired that we would go and refresh our access token. And it was always this painful process. So this library does all of that behind the scenes for you. So what I should be able to do is just run it as is. And it looks like everything's good. Hey, I didn't get asked to log in or anything along that nature. It just made my request. So I think that's awesome because now I don't have to handle any of that mess. So pretty cool. KC, all right. And then Control K, no, Control KU. Let's try symbol regex. That should still be a good one. I gotta remember how we did that one. This one's a little bit different. I can never remember how. Oh, that's right. I can show you a really messy one. It's not messy, but I would just warn you that it can get messy. Yeah, it's fine. It doesn't matter. It's going to return a bunch of data, so just be ready, if I remember correctly. So basically, I'm going to do a symbols regex search, and all I'm really saying is anything that starts with M. Well, guess what? There's a lot of stuff that starts with M. A lot of stuff. And we're off. Oh, that wasn't too bad. I don't know why. I thought there was more for some reason. Maybe I did a different letter before. But as you can see with something like this, now it's returning anything it sees with M. So obviously, this can be a lot of different things. And it's not just equity. It could be ETFs. It can be, I think, even option. No, maybe not options. But a lot of different stuff can come back. It's not just equity. It can be a lot of different things. So, and then again, different exchanges. It's not just restricted. It's pretty much anything. So the previous two examples, they all worked. In other words, I gave it a valid argument. What I'm going to do next is I'm going to give it an invalid argument. So this one should return an error. And if it doesn't, uh-oh. So in this case, we want an error. Hey, here we go. Perfect. So first thing you want to do is you want to recognize that it does tell you it's a value error. So it's saying, hey, this is an invalid value. But if you go right up here to the top, what I try to do is I try to guide you into what the possible arguments are. So I say the value you pass through is not valid. Please choose one of the following valid values. And I tell you what they are. I say symbol search, symbol regex, description search, description regex, and fundamental. So if you give me a bad value, I'm going to do my best to kind of guide you into what it should be. So that's really how this should work. Okay, so that's using the other argument, or sorry, this is the other endpoint. What we're going to do next is we're going to define another endpoint, which is really, I would say it's leveraging the same exact thing that you're kind of seeing here. It's kind of worthless, honestly, to do this particular endpoint on a weekend because it's not going to return anything because it's giving you like the top 10 movers and things like that. And for whatever reason, that one doesn't work on the weekends, but on weekdays it will. Who would have guessed, right? But regardless, I still want to do it because I think it's a good opportunity to kind of show you how it works. Or you know what's a different one maybe we could do? I think it would be a little bit, maybe market hours. I think market hours would be maybe a little bit more meaningful. Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I mean, it's kind of the same. No, actually, that's a good one because it actually leverages both. We'll do that one because I think that's more, I would call it useful. The top mover one, I mean, it's not that it's a bad endpoint. It's just, it kind of doesn't do anything for us right now. What is it called though? What did I call it? Ah, God. Here we go. Get market hours. Okay. Yeah, we'll just take that part. I don't want the documentation string at this point, even though I'm sure I'm going to need it. That's how it usually works. I don't copy it and then I need it. Okay, so the get market hours endpoint, what it allows you to do is it gets the market hours for a particular day. And so you can pass through a date, and if you pass through that date, it will give you the market hours for the particular markets that you pass through. So the thing is, you can pass through multiple markets, and because there's so few markets that it can possibly be, I can also validate them for you. So what we're going to do is we are going to do the steps that we normally do, which is we first validate our token, and then we first grab our headers. Then from there, we can validate our arguments. And this one will take self.validatearguments. We're going to have our endpoint equal, what is it? Get market hours. And then once we've done that, we're going to define our parameter name. And then this one will be markets, so S at the end. And then we want the parameter argument. And so this one will be markets, basically whatever we pass through here. Now I can't validate, well, I probably could validate the date, to be honest. And dates is a whole different topic that I have to work on a little bit. There's things like time zone considerations that we have to also think about. And so there's just things that potentially could mess us up. And I have to look a little bit more into that about how we should approach that. But regardless, assuming everything went fine, your arguments were correct, and we could validate them, let's move on and basically take a list of these arguments and combine them into a single string that we can then pass through to the endpoint. And so what we're going to do is handle a list of multiple values. And so we're going to do self.prepare arguments list. And then what we're going to do is we're going to say parameter list is going to equal whatever we pass through for market. So if it's one item, it's fine. If it's two items, it'll join those two lists in that item. And we do want to store it in a variable so we can use it later. And then from here, we can build our particular request. Just to kind of save some time, I'll take this and just change some of the keys on them a little bit. And the first one will obviously be our markets. And then this one will be markets. And then this one will be the date. And this one will be the date as well. Okay, so that's good. We can define our endpoint because if we don't have anywhere to send it, it's kind of pointless. Endpoint, we will do market data and then /hours. Okay, and then from here, it's again the same exact thing. We're going to still make a request, and we're still going to pass through our headers. We're still going to pass through our URL, and then we're still going to pass through a verified request. And again, I knew I would do something. I forgot to build the URL. It's kind of pointless to make a request without a URL. And then obviously anything that comes back, we are going to parse the JSON string. So we're expecting a JSON string back. All right. So now that we've done that, what we'll do is, I'm going to just delete all this for right now. Okay, perfect. We'll call this single market. And then again, this will just be a list. And then multiple markets. And then this will also be a list. Perfect. I think I have some example values down here. Yeah, perfect. It's kind of confusing because you would think like, oh, it's going to be the equity, the equity Forex or, the Dow Jones, right? Or NASDAQ. No, unfortunately it's not. Okay. So now that we've done that, we can make our request to the get market hours endpoint. And so we'll say market hours that will equal our TD session. And then did I save it? Okay. Sometimes I've noticed that sometimes, I don't know, maybe it's just this file, but for whatever reason, IntelliSense doesn't update real time, but then in my other folders it has. I don't understand why, but it is what it is. Okay, so this one's going to take markets, and then we want to do a single market first, and then it needs to be a date. Now, right now the date has to be a particular string, and it does have to be a date in the future. So technically, if I pass this through right now, it's going to return an error. But what I can do is I can say like, hey, on, I don't know, 11, okay, 17, 18. So 11:18. What are the market hours going to be, right? And so what we can do is see what they will be. Okay, and so again, it's only a single market. And what I'm actually going to do too is I'm going to make sure this one doesn't run again, because otherwise it's just going to take up more of the command prompt than I want to, or the terminal. Perfect. So as you can see, it returned everything for us, and it does give us time zone information too. So that's actually kind of useful, again, if you're thinking about using this API real time. So that was a single market. I want to see what it's going to do with multiple markets. It should work the same. This is kind of an interesting one, because I guess you could technically, let me just try it out instead of guessing, just see. So with multiple markets, obviously it returns multiple different market hours. I'm going to try this with a weekend one and see if it gives us anything. Oh, it does. Okay, so that's fine. I don't know why. I thought for some reason it didn't give me any hours. But I also do want to let you know too that, obviously if you put in something that, isn't right, just say Dow Jones or something that is not one of the possible values, it will, it's going to raise a value error. And it's going to do the same thing too. It's still going to try to guide you in the right direction. Say like, hey, wait a minute, whatever you're passing through, it's not correct. And so we want to make sure what you're passing through is correct. So at this point, I think I'll kind of, finish off the video. I think I've kept everybody long enough. Couple notes. I think for the TD library, this is going to be the last video for a little bit. I really don't want to kind of introduce other stuff until I am pretty comfortable it's good to go. So things like the orders, that just needs more work, and it's just going to take a while to kind of get that up to speed. I mean, it's almost there, but until it's ready, I don't really think it's worthwhile to kind of start getting into it. But I think at this point, you have enough to use the API, understand how it's working. Again, if you want to take it and use it in your own little world and try to, adjust it, I think you have enough of how does it work and what is it doing to kind of modify it as you see fit. So yeah, I think for right now, this will be fine. kind of in the future, like I said, we're going to obviously do the order thing. A lot of people have been asking about a trading robot, a lot of people. So I have started that. We do have some, things we can do to make this where it runs real time. I kind of always caution people with that because you really want to make sure you understand what you're getting and how you're trading. Especially when you're talking about real time, you really want to make sure you understand what your strategy is and do you have the necessary information to calculate the indicators that you need to? Are you able to get the data fast enough and at the right period level in order to make the decision you need to make? So it is coming, but again, that's kind of down the road. And then really what I think the next series I'm going to kind of start getting to is Python Net. So Python Net is where we're going to start seeing how to interact with the .NET CLR to control different Office libraries. So this is what I would call the next stage of Win32com, but I would call it the more modern version of it. So we're going to actually do something like build our own Excel library. Pretty cool, right? So yeah, if you have any questions, obviously, feel free to leave them in the comments below. And then again, if you want to contribute to the library, by all means, reach out. You can find my email on the YouTube channel. You can find it on the library. There's lots of places. So again, if you want to reach out and maybe help contribute, or you just see a way to improve it, by all means, come on out and move along. So yeah, with that being said though, thanks again for watching everybody, and we'll see you in the next video.